She whispered, "This is all I can afford to feed my kids," and the man behind her froze. The line went silent. The cashier's scanner beeped once, twice, then stopped, because the stranger who heard her was already pulling out a black card. Not out of pity, but purpose. And when Sarah Quinlan looked up at him, she saw something impossible in his eyes: recognition. The kind that doesn't come from coincidence, but from fate. Because this man hadn't just saved her dinner. He was about to rewrite her entire life. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I'll be bringing you another story just as powerful as this one. You don't want to miss it. Now back to our story. No one in the checkout line looked at her twice. Under the sterile buzz of fluorescent lights in a packed supermarket, Sarah Quinlan stood clutching the last coins in her worn purse. At 30, she carried the exhaustion of someone decades older. Her twins squirmed against her chest while her eldest son clung silently to her sleeve. The cashier scanned the items: 2 cartons of milk, a loaf of bread, a single bag of rice, and announced the total. Sarah's hands trembled as she counted out what little she had. It wasn't enough. She whispered the words again, this time barely audible, an apology no mother should ever have to make. Behind her, people sighed with impatience. The cashier looked away, uncomfortable. But one man didn't move. One man heard every word. A worn purse and a handful of coins stood between Sarah's promise to her children and complete defeat. Sarah Quinlan knew what those groceries would cost before the cashier even reached for the scanner. She'd calculated it 3 times while walking the aisles, her mental arithmetic a desperate ritual of subtraction and sacrifice. But knowing the price and accepting what it meant were 2 entirely different wars, and tonight she was losing both. The overhead lights of the supermarket hummed their indifferent tune, a low mechanical drone that filled the cavernous space but offered no warmth. For Sarah, it had become the soundtrack to her rising panic, a melody she knew too well. At 30, she felt as though the weight of the world had compressed itself onto her narrow shoulders, a burden that was both crushing and hers alone to bear. Her children were her universe. The twins, Tala and Riven, were barely 2 years old, identical bundles of energy and need pressed against her tired body. Aiden, her 5-year-old, was too quiet for a boy his age, his small hand gripping her coat as if afraid she might disappear. They were her reason for everything, every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every prayer whispered into the dark. But today, even the thought of their faces couldn't pierce through the thick fog of their circumstances. Sarah stood frozen in the checkout line, her cart stripped down to absolute survival. There was the store-brand bread, its plastic wrapper already slightly torn. 2 cartons of milk that would last them maybe 3 days if she watered down their cereal. A single 5-pound bag of rice that would become breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And tucked beside it all, a small jar of peanut butter, the only protein she could afford, when a hand reached past her shoulder. "Let me," a quiet voice said. Before she could protest, before she could even turn fully around, a black credit card slid across the scanner. The transaction chimed its approval. Sarah spun to face him, the man in the dark coat, tall and still, his eyes holding something she couldn't name. Grief, maybe. Or recognition. "I can't," she started. "Every child deserves to eat," he said simply. His voice carried no pity, no judgment. Just fact. And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd before she could find the words trapped in her throat. The walk home felt different. Sarah had made this journey 100 times before, the twins heavy in her arms, Aiden dragging his feet beside her, the canvas grocery bags cutting into her shoulders. But tonight the weight felt lighter. Not the physical burden, that was the same, but something else. Something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Hope. Her apartment building loomed ahead, 5 stories of cracked brick and rusted fire escapes. The 3rd-floor unit had been home for 2 years now, ever since she'd sold the house to pay off the last of Marcus's medical bills. The elevator was broken again, so she climbed the stairs slowly, Tala and Riven taking turns fussing against her chest while Aiden held tight to the railing. Inside, the apartment was exactly as she'd left it, small, worn, but clean. She'd made sure of that. The furniture was second-hand, the walls needed paint, and the kitchen was barely big enough to turn around in. But it was theirs. Safe. Warm enough. Sarah set the groceries on the counter with a reverence that felt almost sacred. "Mama, I'm hungry," Aiden said quietly, hovering near the refrigerator. I know, sweetheart. Give me just a minute. She worked quickly, muscle memory guiding her hands. White rice in the cooker, a splash of oil, a pinch of salt. While it steamed, she made peanut butter sandwiches on the cheap bread, cutting them into triangles the way Aiden liked. She poured milk into 3 plastic cups, actual milk, not watered down, not rationed, and set them on the small kitchen table that doubled as everything in their lives. The children ate like it was a feast. Sarah watched them from the counter, her own stomach empty but content. Tala and Riven smeared peanut butter across their cheeks, giggling at each other. Aiden ate slowly, carefully, his eyes flicking to her between bites as if checking to make sure this was real, that the food wouldn't disappear. "It's okay, baby," she said softly. "There's enough." For tonight, at least, it was true. After dinner, she bathed them in the narrow tub, the twins splashing while Aiden sat quietly, always the observer. She dressed them in mismatched pajamas, hand-me-downs from a neighbor, and tucked them into the one bed they all shared. Her bed. The only bed. "Mama," Aiden whispered as she smoothed his hair back. Who was that man? She'd been asking herself the same question. "I don't know," she admitted. "But he was kind." "Will we see him again?" "Probably not, sweetheart." Aiden nodded, already half asleep. Within minutes, all 3 of them were breathing in that steady, peaceful rhythm that only children could manage. Sarah stood in the doorway watching them, her heart too full and too broken all at once. She thought of Marcus, of the husband who should have been here to see this, who should have been the one putting food on the table, tucking their children into bed, holding her when the weight became too much. But Marcus was gone, 3 years now, taken by an illness that had drained their savings before it drained his life. She tried to be both parents. Tried to be enough. Most days, she failed. But tonight, because of a stranger's kindness, her children had full bellies and easy sleep. Tonight, the food felt like more than survival. It felt like a promise that maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't forgotten them entirely. Sarah returned to the kitchen and put away the remaining groceries with the same careful reverence. Every item accounted for. Every meal planned. She would make this last. She had to. Across the city, Cale Arden stood in the kitchen of his penthouse, staring at 2 teacups. One for him. One for Lyra. It was a ritual he couldn't break, even 3 years after her death. Chamomile with honey, the way she'd liked it. He'd set her cup on the marble counter beside his, steam rising into the empty air, and pretend for just a moment that she was still here. That she might walk through the doorway, barefoot and smiling, and ask him about his day. But Lyra never came. The silence of the penthouse pressed against him like a physical weight. 30 floors above the city, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a skyline that glittered with indifferent beauty, and Cale felt nothing but cold. He'd bought this place for her. Filled it with art she loved, books she read, light she craved. Now it was a mausoleum. He lifted his cup but didn't drink. Instead he heard it again, that voice from the grocery store, trembling and raw. "This is all I can afford to feed my kids." He'd gone to the store for something meaningless. Coffee, maybe. Or nothing at all. Just a reason to leave the penthouse, to exist somewhere other than these empty rooms. He hadn't expected to see her. Hadn't expected those words to crack him open. A mother's desperation. A child's silent hope. It reminded him too much of Lyra. Of the foundation she'd started, the people she'd fought for, the belief she'd carried that kindness wasn't weakness but courage. She would have helped that woman without hesitation. So he had. Cale told himself it was nothing. A small gesture. Groceries paid. A transaction completed. But he couldn't stop thinking about her face. The shame in her eyes. The way her children had clung to her like she was their entire world, because she was. He set down the teacup and pulled out his phone. His assistant answered on the second ring. "Mr. Arden?" "The grocery store transaction from this evening," Cale said quietly. "Can you trace it?" A pause. "Sir." "The woman whose groceries I paid for. I want to know her name." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course. May I ask why?" Cale stared at Lyra's untouched tea, the steam now fading. "I just want to know her name," he said. And even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He wanted more than that. He wanted to understand why this one moment, this one woman, had stirred something in him that had been dead for 3 years. He wanted to know if kindness could still mean something. If he could still mean something. "I'll have the information by morning," his assistant said. "Thank you." Cale ended the call and stood alone in his cold, beautiful prison, listening to the silence and wondering what he'd just set in motion. The file arrived before dawn. Cale hadn't slept. He'd spent the night at his desk overlooking the city, the lights below blurring into constellations that meant nothing. When his phone chimed with the incoming email, he opened it immediately. Subject: Grocery transaction, individual identified. Sarah Quinlan. Age 30. Single mother of 3. Current address: 1247 Ashwood Terrace, Unit 3B. Employment history includes previous position at the Emberline Cafe, 2019 to 2021. Cale stopped reading. The Emberline Cafe. He said the name aloud into the empty room, and it felt like speaking a prayer. The cafe had been Lyra's project, her heart made manifest in brick and espresso machines. A neighborhood bakery in a struggling area, designed to be more than just a business, a gathering place, a lifeline, a proof that small acts of community could matter. Lyra had funded it entirely. Hired people who needed second chances. Stayed open late so students had somewhere safe to study. She'd poured herself into that place right up until the diagnosis, until the treatment stole her strength, until she couldn't pour anything anymore. The cafe had closed 6 months after her death. Cale hadn't been able to look at it. And now this woman he'd helped in a grocery store, this stranger whose desperation had cracked something open inside him, she had worked there, had been part of Lyra's vision. "It's not a coincidence," Cale whispered to the empty room. He pulled up more information. Employment dates: Sarah had started at the Emberline shortly after her husband's death, worked there for 2 years as a barista and occasional manager. Left when the cafe closed, presumably because she had no choice. Cale sat back, his mind racing. For 3 years he'd been sleepwalking through his life, going through motions that meant nothing, building wealth that served no purpose. Lyra had begged him, near the end, to continue her work, to not let grief make him small. He'd failed her. But maybe this was a second chance. Maybe fate was less coincidence and more invitation. Cale opened a new email to his assistant. "Find everything you can about the Emberline Cafe building. I want to know who owns it, what condition it's in, and what it would take to reopen it." He paused, then added, "And set up the Emberline Revival Project. A community foundation. I want it operational within the month." Sarah discovered the job posting at 11:47 p.m., 3 days after the grocery store. She'd been scrolling through employment websites the way she did every night after the children were asleep, desperately, hopelessly, clicking through positions she was either underqualified or overqualified for, wages that wouldn't cover rent, schedules that demanded she be in 2 places at once. Then she saw it. The Emberline Project Foundation Community Cafe Coordinator wanted. The name stopped her cold. Emberline. She knew that name. Had loved that name once, when it meant morning shifts filled with the smell of fresh bread, customers who knew her by name, a manager who let her bring Aiden to work when childcare fell through. She clicked the posting with trembling hands. The Emberline Revival Project seeks a coordinator to manage the reopening of a community-focused cafe dedicated to supporting families and fostering connection. Ideal candidate will have experience in hospitality, strong organizational skills, and a passion for community service. Previous experience with the Emberline Cafe preferred but not required. Sarah read it 3 times. It felt impossible. Too good to be real. Positions like this, meaningful work with reasonable hours and the promise of purpose, didn't appear in her life. They belonged to other people, luckier people, people whose husbands were still alive. But the name. The Emberline. She thought of the grocery store, of the stranger who'd paid for her milk and bread. Of how that one act of kindness had made her feel seen, remembered, human. Maybe the universe was capable of more than one small miracle. At 12:03 a.m., Sarah Quinlan opened a blank document and began writing a cover letter. She wrote about her time at the original cafe, about learning to make the perfect cappuccino and memorizing regulars' orders. She wrote about her children, about understanding the struggles of parents trying to hold everything together. She wrote honestly, without embellishment, because she had nothing left to lose. At 12:47 a.m., she hit submit. Then she closed her laptop, climbed into bed beside her sleeping children, and let herself hope. Cale reviewed applications on a Tuesday afternoon, sunlight streaming through his office windows. There were 37 candidates. His assistant had pre-screened them, flagging the strongest resumes with detailed notes about experience and qualifications. Cale scrolled through methodically, reading each cover letter with the same careful attention Lyra would have demanded. Then he reached application number 23. Sarah Quinlan. His hand froze on the mouse. He opened her file slowly, almost afraid of what he'd find. Her resume was sparse, gaps in employment, positions that had ended when businesses closed or circumstances changed. But her cover letter. I worked at the Emberline Cafe during the hardest period of my life. It was more than a job. It was a reminder that community means showing up for each other, especially when showing up is hard. I would be honored to help rebuild something that once gave me so much hope. Cale read it twice. Then a third time. He thought about that moment in the grocery store, the way her voice had broken when she'd said she couldn't afford to feed her children. He thought about Lyra, about the foundation she'd wanted to build, about all the Sarahs in the world who just needed someone to see them. This wasn't coincidence. This was purpose finding its way back to him. Cale picked up his phone. Schedule interviews, he told his assistant. Start with Sarah Quinlan. The email arrived on a Thursday morning while Sarah was washing breakfast dishes, her phone propped against the faucet so she could see if anyone called about the second job she'd applied for at a call center. Subject: Interview request, the Emberline Project. Her hands went still in the soapy water. Dear Ms. Quinlan, thank you for your application to the Emberline Project Foundation. We were impressed by your experience and would like to invite you for an interview. Please let us know your availability this week. Warm regards, Celeste Gable, Director of Community Operations. Sarah read it 4 times before she trusted that it was real. Then she dried her hands with shaking fingers and typed a reply confirming her availability, her heart hammering against her ribs. An interview. A real interview. She had 3 days to prepare, which meant 3 days to panic. Monday arrived with cruel sunshine, the kind of bright morning that felt like mockery when you were nervous. Sarah stood in front of her closet, if the narrow alcove with a tension rod could be called that, staring at her options. She owned one interview-appropriate blouse. White, slightly worn at the collar, but clean and pressed. She'd bought it 4 years ago for a bank interview she hadn't gotten. It still fit, barely, though it pulled slightly at the shoulders now. It would have to be enough. She dressed carefully, her hands steadier than she'd expected. Dark pants from the thrift store. The white blouse. A cardigan that covered the worst of the wear. She braided her hair simply, applied minimal makeup, and studied herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked tired. Older than 30. But presentable. You can do this, she whispered to her reflection. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chun, had agreed to watch the children. Sarah kissed each of them goodbye, Tala and Riven distracted by blocks, Aiden watching her with those 2 knowing eyes. Good luck, Mama, he said softly. She held him a moment longer than necessary. The Emberline Project office was in a renovated building downtown, all exposed brick and modern fixtures that spoke of money invested with care. Sarah climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, her heartbeat loud in her ears, and found the door marked with a simple bronze plaque. Inside, the reception area was warm. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, photographs of smiling people on the walls. A young woman at the desk looked up and smiled. Sarah Quinlan? Yes. Mrs. Gable is expecting you. Right this way. Sarah followed her down a short hallway to an office with windows overlooking the street. Behind a desk sat a woman in her 50s, silver hair swept back, wearing glasses on a beaded chain and a smile that crinkled her eyes. Sarah, she said, standing immediately. I'm Celeste Gable. Please sit. Sarah sat, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Mrs. Gable's warmth was unexpected, genuine in a way that made Sarah's guard lower slightly. They talked about her experience at the original Emberline, about her children, about what community meant. Mrs. Gable asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers, nodding, taking notes, treating Sarah like someone whose perspective mattered. You wrote that the cafe gave you hope, Mrs. Gable said gently. Can you tell me more about that? Sarah hesitated, then decided on truth. My husband died while I was working there, she said quietly. I was drowning. But my manager, She let me bring my son to work. The regulars knew my story and left extra tips. People showed up for me. The Emberline taught me that we don't survive alone. Mrs. Gable's eyes softened. And now I want to be the person who shows up for someone else. The words hung in the air, simple and honest. Mrs. Gable smiled. I think you'll fit perfectly here. In his downtown office, Cale watched the interview through a video feed his assistant had discreetly set up. He saw Sarah's nervousness, her careful answers, the way she held herself together even when questions probed tender places. He saw her strength, her authenticity. When the interview ended, he called his assistant immediately. Hire her, he said, and don't tell her who I am. Sir. She doesn't need to know about the grocery store. She doesn't need to know I'm involved at all. She earned this position. I want her to believe that. A pause. Understood. Cale ended the call and sat back, watching Sarah leave the building through his window high above. She walked with her shoulders straighter than when she'd arrived, and something in his chest shifted. Lyra would have liked her. The call came 2 days later. Sarah was folding laundry when her phone rang, an unknown number she almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. Ms. Quinlan? This is Celeste Gable. I'm calling with good news. We'd like to offer you the position of Community Cafe Coordinator. Sarah sat down hard on the couch. Are you serious? Mrs. Gable laughed warmly. Completely serious. You were exactly what we were looking for. Can you start Monday? Yes, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. After the call ended, she sat holding the phone, tears streaming down her face while her children played around her. For the first time in 3 years, the future felt like something other than survival. It felt like possibility. The Emberline Cafe had been transformed. Sarah stood in the doorway on her first day, barely recognizing the space she'd once known. The bones were the same, exposed brick, tall windows, the long counter where she'd once pulled espresso shots, but everything else gleamed with renewal. New equipment, fresh paint, furniture that invited people to stay a while. It was the cafe she remembered, but better. Whole. Beautiful, isn't it? Mrs. Gable appeared beside her, smiling. Our founder wanted to honor the original vision while making it sustainable. Your founder, Sarah echoed. I still don't know who that is. He prefers to stay anonymous. A silent investor, you might say. He believes good work should speak for itself. Mrs. Gable handed her a tablet. But he's given us an incredible budget and complete freedom to build something meaningful. So let's build it. The first weeks passed in a blur of purpose. Sarah hired staff carefully, people who needed second chances, who understood that a cafe could be more than transactions. She designed programs with Mrs. Gable's support, a sliding scale menu, a kids' corner with books and toys, evening community dinners where anyone could come regardless of ability to pay. The cafe opened quietly at first, a soft launch to work out the systems. But word spread quickly in the neighborhood. People came for coffee and stayed for connection. Single parents found childcare advice and sympathetic ears. Students claimed tables for studying. Elderly regulars established their favorite seats. The space came alive exactly as Lyra had once dreamed. Sarah discovered she was good at this, creating warmth, reading what people needed, building systems that served rather than restricted. Her confidence grew with each day, each small success, each person who thanked her for making them feel welcome. She felt like herself again. Or perhaps a version of herself she'd never been before. The silent investor appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was behind the counter, training a new barista on the espresso machine, when Mrs. Gable entered with a tall man in a dark coat. He moved with quiet self-assurance, his eyes taking in every detail of the space. Sarah, Mrs. Gable called. Come meet one of our investors. This is Cale Arden. The name meant nothing to her. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached, offering a professional smile. Mr. Arden. Welcome. When he turned to face her fully, something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or something more complicated. But his voice remained neutral. Ms. Quinlan. I've heard excellent things about your work here. Thank you. The cafe is, she paused, searching for words. It feels right. Like it's doing what it's supposed to do. That's exactly what we hoped for. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary. Sarah felt an odd pull, something familiar she couldn't place, but Mrs. Gable was already guiding him toward the community board, explaining programs and metrics. Cale returned weekly after that, always with business reasons, checking on investments, reviewing budgets, meeting with Mrs. Gable. But he always found moments to talk with Sarah. Brief conversations over coffee, discussions about upcoming programs, quiet observations about the community they were serving. Each conversation felt weighted with something unspoken. "You have a gift for this," he said one afternoon, watching her interact with a young mother struggling to order while managing 2 toddlers. Sarah had quickly assembled a kid's meal, pulled a coloring book from behind the counter, and handled the transaction with grace that made the mother's shoulders relax. "I just remember what it's like," Sarah said simply, "to need someone to see you." Cale's expression shifted, something vulnerable crossing his face before he masked it. "Yes. I imagine you do." 3 months in, Sarah proposed the free meal program. She'd been watching the evening crowd, parents stretching dinner over hours, people ordering nothing but water, children whose eyes tracked every plate that passed. She recognized the signs. She'd lived them. She drafted a proposal and brought it to Mrs. Gable nervously. "A weekly community dinner," she explained. "Free to anyone who comes. No questions, no proof of need. Just food and fellowship. We could partner with local suppliers, maybe get donations." "How much would it cost?" Mrs. Gable asked. Sarah handed over her carefully researched budget, expecting pushback, expecting the compassionate no that she'd heard so many times before. Mrs. Gable smiled. "Let me run this past our benefactor." In his penthouse office, Cale read Sarah's proposal twice. No questions, no proof of need. Just food and fellowship. He thought of her in that grocery store, whispering that she couldn't afford to feed her children. He thought of Lyra, who had always believed that dignity mattered as much as charity. He called his assistant. "The free meal program Sarah proposed. Approve the full budget. Double it, actually. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. Shall I notify Mrs. Gable?" "Yes. And make sure Sarah knows the idea was brilliant." He ended the call and stood at his window, looking out over the city. Somewhere down there, Sarah was building exactly what Lyra had envisioned, a place where kindness wasn't transactional, where people mattered simply because they were people. And for the first time since Lyra's death, Cale felt like he was part of something that mattered. The grand reopening ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday in November, exactly 6 months after Sarah's first day. The cafe had been transformed for the occasion. String lights draped across the ceiling, fresh flowers on every table, a banner reading the Ember Line, "Community built on hope." Local press had been invited, along with donors, community leaders, and regulars who'd become family. Sarah stood near the back, watching the crowd gather, and felt overwhelmed by what they'd built. Mrs. Gable found her there, elegant in a navy dress, and squeezed her hand. "You should be proud," she said. "This is as much yours as anyone's." "It feels like a dream," Sarah admitted. "Dreams can be real. You just have to believe they're possible." Mrs. Gable guided her toward the small platform they'd set up. "Now come on. People want to hear from you." Sarah's heart hammered as she took the microphone. She'd prepared brief remarks, practiced them with her children as an audience. But looking out at all these faces, staff who'd become friends, families they'd served, the community they'd gathered, the prepared words felt insufficient. She spoke from her heart instead. "6 months ago, I walked through that door expecting just a job," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "What I found was a reminder that we survive by taking care of each other. The Ember Line isn't just a cafe. It's proof that kindness isn't weakness. That community isn't charity. That every person who walks through that door matters, not because of what they can afford, but because they're here." She paused, emotion tightening her throat. "Someone once told me that every child deserves to eat. But the truth is bigger than that. Every person deserves to be seen, to be valued, to have a place where they belong. That's what we've built here. That's what we'll keep building. Thank you for being part of it." The applause felt like warmth, like acceptance, like home. Mrs. Gable returned to the microphone as Sarah stepped down. Thank you, Sarah. And now, I'd like to introduce the person who made all of this possible. Our founder and primary benefactor has chosen to remain anonymous until now, but tonight he's here to see what his vision has become. Please welcome Cale Arden. Sarah's head snapped up. Cale emerged from the crowd, tall and quiet in his dark coat, and walked to the platform. The applause continued, but Sarah barely heard it. She was staring at his face, memory clicking into place with devastating clarity. The grocery store. The stranger who'd paid for her milk and bread. The man she'd been working with for 6 months, whose quiet presence had become unexpectedly important. They were the same person. Her vision blurred. She couldn't breathe. Cale spoke briefly, thanking the staff, honoring Lyra's original vision, praising the community's response. But his eyes kept finding Sarah in the crowd, watching her process the truth, seeing the exact moment understanding crashed over her. When the ceremony ended and people dispersed into conversation and celebration, Sarah found herself standing alone near the back door, her mind reeling. Sarah. She turned. Cale stood a few feet away, his expression guarded but open. Waiting. It was you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. At the store. It was you. Yes. And this, all of this, was already being planned, he said quickly. But yes. When I learned you'd worked at the original Emberline, when I saw your application, it felt like fate. Sarah shook her head, overwhelmed. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? Because you earned this position. Your skills, your passion, your vision for what this place could be, that was all you. I didn't want you to think it was charity or pity or some billionaire's whim. You deserved to know you were chosen because you were the right person. But you chose me because... I chose you because you're brilliant at this work, Cale interrupted gently. The grocery store was coincidence. Or fate. Or whatever you want to call moments that change everything. But your job here? That's merit. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You said every child deserves to eat. I meant it. You paid for my groceries and disappeared. I didn't know how to stay. The words hung between them, honest and raw. Sarah studied his face and saw what she'd been too overwhelmed to notice before. The grief that shadowed his eyes, the loneliness that matched her own, the desperate hope that maybe kindness could still mean something. Why? She asked finally. Why did you help me that night? Cale's expression softened. Because you reminded me that kindness still matters. That people still matter. My wife believed that. She built the original Emberline because she believed small acts of compassion could change lives. After she died, I forgot. But then I saw you, heard you, and I remembered. Your wife. Lyra. She would have loved what you've done here. Sarah wiped her eyes, laughing through tears. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. But she did. Because words mattered, and this man had given her back something she'd thought was lost forever. That night in the store, I was invisible, she said softly. Just another struggling parent, another sad story. But you saw me. You didn't save me, you reminded me that people still see each other. That we can still show up for each other. Thank you for that. And thank you for this. She gestured at the cafe, at the community gathered in celebration, at the hope they'd built together. Cale smiled, and it transformed his face from severe to something approaching peace. No, he said quietly. Thank you. For reminding me why any of this matters. They stood together in the glow of string lights and community, two people who'd found each other through shared loss and mutual hope, and something passed between them, not romance, not obligation, but recognition. Understanding. The knowledge that sometimes healing happens not in isolation, but in reaching toward another person and finding them reaching back. Outside, the November night was cold. But inside the Emberline, warmth spilled from every corner, laughter echoed off brick walls, and two broken people discovered that kindness, when genuine and sustained, could become something greater than either of them alone. It could become legacy. Delphine Rourke had been Cale's associate for 5 years, and in that time she'd learned to read his moods like weather patterns. She knew when to push, when to retreat, when to position herself as indispensable. But lately, the weather had changed. She noticed it first in small ways, the frequency of his visits to the Emberline, the way his voice softened when he mentioned Sarah Quinlan, the hours he spent reviewing cafe reports that should have been delegated to Mrs. Gable. Cale, who'd been unreachable since Lyra's death, was suddenly present again. And Delphine hated it. She'd spent years positioning herself as his closest advisor, the one person he trusted with his business empire. She'd imagined, in her more ambitious moments, that proximity might become something more, that grief would eventually soften into need, that she could fill the space Lyra had left. Instead, he was filling it with a single mother who served coffee and smiled at strangers. It was insulting. Delphine began her campaign subtly. A question here, a concern there, seeds planted in conversations with other board members. Have you noticed how much time Cale spends at the cafe? It's wonderful what Ms. Quinlan has built, but do we really know her qualifications? I heard she worked there years ago. Isn't it convenient that she's now in charge? The whispers grew roots. At a fundraising dinner, she mentioned to a board member that Sarah had been hired after a chance encounter with Cale. She didn't say more, didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Within 2 weeks, the rumors had spread beyond the boardroom. Someone posted on social media, an anonymous account, though Delphine knew how to cover her tracks, questioning whether the Emberline project was legitimate charity or a billionaire's vanity project for his friend. The comments multiplied. Screenshots circulated. Local blogs picked up the story, framing it as potential corruption, a wealthy man using philanthropy to benefit someone he knew personally. The damage spread like wildfire. Sarah saw the first post on a Tuesday morning while checking the cafe's social media accounts. @TruthSeeker2024. Anyone else think it's weird that #Emberline Cafe coordinator just happens to be besties with the Billionaire founder? How exactly did she earn this job? Thinking face. Her stomach dropped. She scrolled through the comments, speculation, accusations, people she'd never met making judgments about her character, her work, her motives. Someone had dug up a photo from the grand opening, zoomed in on her standing near Cale, added a caption about wealthy men and the women who manipulate them. Her hands shook as she set down her phone. Mrs. Gable found her in the office an hour later, staring blankly at her computer screen. Sarah. Her voice was gentle. You've seen it. How bad is it? The board is calling for a review. They want a full audit of your hiring process, your qualifications, any connections you might have had to Cale before your employment. I didn't have any connections, Sarah said, her voice hollow. I didn't even know who he was. I know that. Cale knows that. But perception matters, and right now. Someone's trying to destroy what we built. Mrs. Gable sat down heavily. Delphine Rourke has been asking questions. Making suggestions. I think she's behind this. Why? What did I do to her? Nothing. That's the problem. You exist, and you matter to Cale in a way she wanted to matter. Some people can't stand watching others succeed. Sarah closed her eyes. She thought of everything she'd built here, the programs, the community, the second chance she'd been given. She thought of her children, of the stability this job had provided, of feeling valuable for the first time in years. And now it was all crumbling because someone wanted to hurt her. I have to resign, she said quietly. Sarah, no. I won't let this destroy the foundation. If I leave, the story goes away. The cafe survives. The programs continue. That's what matters. Cale won't accept it. He doesn't have a choice. I won't let anyone say I earned this through pity or manipulation or anything other than merit. If the only way to prove that is to walk away, then that's what I'll do. Sarah typed her resignation letter that night after putting the children to bed. Dear Mrs. Gable and the Emberline Board. Effective immediately, I am resigning as Community Cafe Coordinator. Recent events have made it clear that my presence has become a liability to this organization's mission. I will not allow my employment to compromise the Foundation's reputation or the community we serve. Working here has been the greatest honor of my professional life. Thank you for believing in me. Please continue the work we started. With gratitude and respect, Sarah Quinlan. She sent it at 11:43 p.m. and cried herself to sleep. Cale received the forwarded resignation at 6 a.m. and was in his car by 6:15. He called Mrs. Gable on the way. Tell me Sarah's still at home. She won't be at the cafe until 9. Cale, she's devastated. Delphine has poisoned everything. I know exactly what Delphine's done. Call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Every member. Non-negotiable. What are you going to do? What I should have done the moment this started. I'm going to tell them the truth. He hung up and pressed harder on the accelerator. The city blurred past his windows, but all he could see was Sarah's face at the grand opening, the hope in her eyes, the pride in her voice as she spoke about community and kindness. He'd given her that. And he'd be damned if he let Delphine take it away. Cale arrived at Sarah's apartment building as weak morning light filtered through gray clouds. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked. Sarah opened the door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. When she saw him, something crumbled in her expression. "You can't be here," she said. "That's exactly what people think." "I don't care what people think. I care that you're resigning because of lies someone spread to hurt you. That's not acceptable." It doesn't matter if they're lies. The damage is done. People believe. People believe gossip until they're presented with truth. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling a board meeting. I'm going to explain exactly how you were hired, why you were qualified, and what you've accomplished here. And then I'm going to make it very clear that anyone who questions your integrity will be answering to me. Sarah shook her head, tears spilling over. "You can't fight this for me. That just proves what they're saying, that I'm here because of your charity, your pity." "You're here because you're brilliant at this work," Cale said firmly. "Because you understand community in ways most people never will. Because you've taken a vision and made it better than anyone imagined. That's not charity. That's recognition of excellence." "They won't believe that." "Then I'll make them believe it. Sarah, when I met you in that grocery store, you were at your lowest point. But you know what I saw? Strength. Dignity. A woman who'd been beaten down by circumstances, but refused to stop fighting for her children. That's who you are. Not some victim who manipulated her way into a job. You're a warrior. And I'll be damned if I let anyone make you forget that." The words broke something open. Sarah covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking, and Cale stood awkwardly in the hallway, wanting to comfort her but uncertain how. "I'm so tired of fighting," she whispered. "I know. But you don't have to fight alone anymore. That's what all of this has been about, building a community where people show up for each other. Let me show up for you." Sarah lowered her hands, studying his face. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Cale thought of Lyra, of promises made and broken, of 3 years spent hiding from the world. He thought of that night in the grocery store, of how Sarah's desperate whisper had cracked open something he'd thought was dead forever. "Because kindness matters," he said simply. "And you reminded me of that. Now let me return the favor." The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Arden Tower was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a table of polished black granite, chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. 12 board members sat in tense silence as Cale entered, his expression carved from stone. Delphine sat at the far end, perfectly composed in a charcoal suit, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Cale began, remaining standing while everyone else sat. "I understand there are concerns about Sarah Quinlan's employment at the Emberline project." "Concerns is putting it mildly," Delphine said smoothly. "Social media is ablaze with questions about favoritism and improper hiring practices. The Foundation's reputation is at stake." "Then let's address those questions with facts." Cale pulled out a folder. Sarah Quinlan's resume, her application materials, and notes from her interview with Mrs. Gable. She was one of 37 applicants. She was interviewed alongside 6 other finalists. Mrs. Gable, who conducted the interviews independently, ranked her first in qualifications, experience, and vision for the role. He slid copies across the table. Board members picked them up, scanning the documents. "She was hired based on merit," Cale continued. "Period." "But you knew her," Delphine pressed. "You'd met her before the hiring process. That's the appearance of impropriety, even if technically." "I paid for her groceries once," Cale interrupted, his voice cold. "In a supermarket. A momentary act of kindness that lasted less than 3 minutes. I didn't know her name. I didn't know anything about her except that she was struggling to feed her children. The fact that she later applied to the Emberline, a cafe where she'd previously worked years before I was involved, is coincidence. Or fate. But it is not corruption. The room was silent. However, Cale said, his voice softening, there's something you all need to understand about why the Emberline project exists at all. He pulled out a second folder, this one worn at the edges, the kind that had been handled with care. From it, he extracted a handwritten letter on cream-colored paper. His hands shook slightly as he held it. This is a letter from my late wife, Lyra Arden, written 6 months before her death. Some of you knew her. You knew her passion for community service, her belief that wealth came with responsibility, her absolute conviction that small acts of compassion could change the world. He cleared his throat, emotion roughening his voice. She wrote this as a proposal for a foundation she wanted to create. She never got to see it built. After she died, I buried it, along with every other dream she'd had, because I couldn't bear to face what I'd lost. For 3 years, I let her vision die with her. Cale looked up, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. Until I met Sarah Quinlan in a grocery store and remembered why any of this matters. This foundation, this cafe, these programs, they're not mine. They're Lyra's. And Sarah has built exactly what my wife dreamed of. So before you question whether she deserves to be here, let me read you what Lyra wrote. He smoothed the paper, his voice steady now. Kindness is not debt, it's the inheritance of love. Every person who walks through the doors of the Emberline should feel valued not for what they can provide, but for who they are. We build community by seeing each other, by showing up when it's hard, by remembering that we are all one tragedy away from needing help ourselves. I want to create something that outlives me. A place where single mothers can work without shame, where children are welcome, where being poor doesn't mean being invisible. I want to prove that compassion isn't weakness, it's the strongest thing we can offer each other. This is my legacy. Not my money. Not my name. Just this, the knowledge that I spent my life trying to make others' lives a little easier. And if I succeed, maybe someone else will carry it forward. Maybe kindness will become contagious. Cale's voice cracked on the last sentence. He set the letter down gently, as if it were fragile. Sarah Quinlan is carrying it forward, he said quietly. She's making kindness contagious. She's doing exactly what Lyra hoped someone would do. So when you question whether she belongs here, you're not questioning her qualifications or her integrity. You're questioning whether Lyra's dream was worth building at all. The silence in the room was absolute. One of the older board members, a woman who'd known Lyra, wiped her eyes. Another cleared his throat roughly. Several stared at the table, unable to meet Cale's gaze. Delphine's face had gone pale. This foundation exists because my wife believed people matter, Cale continued. Every person, every story, every struggle. Sarah embodies that belief. She's not here because of pity or favoritism or manipulation. She's here because she's exactly who Lyra would have chosen. And I will not tolerate anyone suggesting otherwise. He looked directly at Delphine. Ms. Rourke, I believe you have something to say. Delphine stood slowly, her composure cracking at the edges. She understood what was happening, the trap she'd walked into, the battle she'd already lost. I may have, she said carefully, acted hastily in raising concerns. You spread lies, Cale said flatly. You damaged someone's reputation because you were jealous. And in doing so, you betrayed everything this foundation stands for. I was protecting your interests. You were protecting your own interests. There's a difference. Cale turned to the board. I'm calling for a vote. First, to reinstate Sarah Quinlan with the board's full support and a public statement affirming her qualifications and character. Second, to expand the foundation's budget and scope so we can serve more communities. And third, to accept Ms. Rourke's resignation, effective immediately. I haven't resigned, Delphine said sharply. You will. Or I'll ensure every board you might hope to serve on learns exactly what you did here. Your choice. The vote was unanimous. Delphine gathered her things in icy silence and left without another word. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that sounded like finality. Cale found Sarah in the small garden behind the Emberline, sitting on a bench among the herbs she'd planted. She looked up when he approached, her expression guarded. It's done, he said simply. The board reinstated you. Delphine's gone. There will be a public statement by end of day. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. Because it was right. And because Lyra would have demanded it. Tell me about her, Sarah said softly. Tell me about your wife. So Cale sat beside her in the garden, afternoon sun filtering through the leaves, and talked about Lyra. Her laugh. Her fierce compassion. Her belief that the world could be better if people just tried. He talked until the words ran out, until the grief felt a little lighter, until Sarah's hand found his and squeezed gently. She would have liked you, he said finally. I wish I could have known her. You do know her. You're living her dream. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other through tragedy and built something beautiful from the ruins. Not romance, something both simpler and more profound. Understanding. Partnership. The knowledge that healing happens in community, not isolation. Thank you, Sarah said eventually, for fighting for me. Thank you for reminding me how to fight it all. 2 years later, the Emberline had become more than a cafe. It was a movement. 3 additional locations had opened across the city, each one adapted to its neighborhood's needs while maintaining Lyra's original vision. The free meal program served 2,000 families monthly. The foundation had partnered with local schools, job training programs, and mental health services to create a comprehensive support network for struggling parents. Sarah Quinlan, now Director of Community Impact, oversaw it all. She stood in the original Emberline on a Saturday afternoon in spring, watching the space she'd helped rebuild thrive with life. The lunch rush had passed, leaving the cafe in that peaceful post-storm calm where regulars lingered over coffee and conversation hummed like music. Her children sat at a corner table doing homework. Aiden was 10 now, serious and thoughtful, helping Tala and Riven with their math. The twins were 7, still finishing each other's sentences but developing their own personalities. Tala bold and curious, Riven gentle and observant. They were thriving. More than surviving, actually thriving. Good schools, full bellies, a mother who came home each night exhausted but fulfilled. A life built on stability rather than crisis. The door chimed. Cale entered with a teenage boy, Eris, his son from his marriage to Lyra. The boy was 15 now, spending every weekend volunteering at the cafe, serving meals with the same quiet compassion his mother had modeled. Sarah, Cale greeted, and after 2 years, his smiles came easier. Grief still shadowed him, but it no longer defined him. Eris wanted to show you his proposal for a teen mentorship program. The boy handed over a carefully prepared document, his enthusiasm barely contained. I was thinking we could pair high schoolers with younger kids. Homework help, but also just being there, you know? Having someone who cares. Sarah scanned the proposal, impressed by its thoughtfulness. This is excellent. Let's present it at next week's staff meeting. Eris beamed. Cale's pride was visible, his hand resting briefly on his son's shoulder, a gesture of connection that would have been impossible 3 years ago. Come on, Sarah said to them both. Let's sit outside. The kids can join us. They gathered at the outdoor tables, the ones Cale had designed to catch afternoon sunlight, the ones surrounded by the garden Sarah tended. Aiden, Tala, and Riven abandoned their homework immediately, Eris pulling out a deck of cards to teach them some complicated game. The children's laughter rose into spring air, bright and unrestrained. Sarah and Cale sat side by side, watching them play, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was no need. The scene before them said everything. Children who felt safe, adults who'd found purpose, a community built on the revolutionary idea that people mattered simply because they existed. That night in the store, Sarah said softly, not looking at him, I thought the world had stopped caring. Cale turned to her, his expression gentle. Maybe it just needed someone to remind it how. She smiled. You reminded me. We reminded each other. The cafe behind them glowed with warmth, light spilling through windows, voices rising in fellowship, the smell of fresh bread drifting on the breeze. Inside, volunteers prepared for the evening community dinner. Staff members exchanged easy conversation. Strangers became friends over shared coffee and stories. This was Lyra's legacy. Sarah's vision. Cale's redemption. But more than that, it was proof, tangible and thriving, that kindness, when genuine and sustained, could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. That one moment of compassion in a grocery store could become a foundation serving thousands. That grief and loss, while never erased, could be transformed into something that honored the dead by serving the living. That every person, struggling mother, grieving widower, lonely child, carried within them the potential to change the world, if only someone would see them clearly enough to believe it. Sarah watched her children laugh with Eris, watched the cafe stores welcome another family, watched Kale's face soften with something approaching peace, and felt grateful beyond words. For second chances. For connection. For the stranger who'd paid for her groceries and couldn't walk away. For the legacy of a woman she'd never met but whose vision had saved her life. For all the Emberlands that would come, the communities they'd build, the lives they'd touch, the proof they'd offer that compassion wasn't weakness but the strongest inheritance we can leave. The sun moved lower, painting everything golden. Inside, someone started the espresso machine, that familiar hiss and steam that meant welcome, meant home, meant another day of showing up for each other. Kale caught her eye and smiled. And Sarah smiled back, knowing that this moment, this place, this imperfect beautiful community they'd built from grief and hope, was exactly what the world needed. Not perfection. Not grand gestures. Just people remembering how to see each other. Just kindness, becoming contagious. Just love, inherited and passed forward, one small act at a time. The cafe glowed warmly behind them, a beacon in the gathering dusk, and somewhere in that light, two broken people who'd helped each other heal understood that their story wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever needed reminding that the world still cared. That someone would still show up. That compassion, when given freely, could become the inheritance that changed everything.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.